Malbor, Wiltshire, 1723, was a town stitched together by gossip, grain, and God. Its cobbled streets sloped gently toward the River Kennet, where washerwomen beat linens white and boys fished for eels with bent pins. The market square bustled every Thursday, filled with the scent of baking bread, sheep dung, and the sharp tang of cider from the Lamb Inn. But beneath this orderly surface ran quieter currents of debt, jealousy, and the unspoken rules that governed who could speak and who must stay silent. Margaret Scott had never been good at silence. She'd been born Margaret Harrow in 1675, daughter of a cooper whose hands were calloused from shaping barrels but gentle when braiding her hair. She married Thomas Scott at 19, a kind-eyed weaver with a laugh like gravel and a habit of bringing her violets in spring. They'd had no children, but they'd built a life rich in small joys, shared suppers of pottage and cheese, winter evenings reading psalms by firelight, the way he'd squeeze her hand when passing her in the church aisle. But Thomas died in 1717, leaving Margaret with a cottage, a loom, and a grief so heavy it felt like wearing stone. Widows in Marlborough were expected to fade into prayer, into service, into the background. But Margaret refused to vanish. She kept Thomas's loom running, sold cloth to merchants in Devizes, and spoke her mind when she saw injustice. At first, the town tolerated her. Poor Meg, they'd say. Lost her Tom. Sharp tongue, but good heart. But tolerance has limits. Her first brush with the law came in 1721, when grocer Hargrove shorted old widow Pembleton on flour again. Margaret confronted him in front of his shop. Voice ringing off the timber beams, "You'd cheat a saint if she couldn't count." Hargrove called her a shrew, and the magistrate fined her sixpence for disorderly speech. She paid it, but not before spitting on his doorstep. The second incident was worse. In autumn 1722, Squire Everard, flushed with claret and arrogance, grabbed milkmaid Bess Carter's wrist outside the Lamb, leering about a kiss for fresh cream. Margaret stepped between them, eyes blazing. "Unhand her, you bloated toad, or I'll fetch the constable myself and your wife." Everard laughed, but released Bess. 2 days later, Margaret was summoned for threatening a gentleman. Another fine. Another warning. By early 1723, Magistrate Thorne, a man whose piety masked a hunger for control, had grown weary. "That woman," he told his clerk, "is a thorn in the flesh of civil order." Then came the pig. Mrs. Henshaw, the baker's widow, owned one sow, Bessie, who roamed the lane behind her cottage. One morning, Bessie wandered into the vicar's orchard through a gap in the fence, rotted since the Nightingales. Constable Pike, ever eager to curry favor with the vicar, seized the pig as trespassing livestock. Mrs. Henshaw wept. Bessie was her only source of meat, lard, and coin from piglets. Margaret arrived within the hour. She didn't shout at first. She stood calmly in the muddy yard and said, "Pike, that fence has been broken for months. You know it. The vicar knows it. Taking her pig is theft dressed as law." Pike sneered. "Mind your place, widow." "My place," Margaret said, voice low but carrying, "is beside those you crush because they're too tired to fight back." A crowd gathered. Words escalated. Someone shouted scold. A child began to cry. By dusk, the magistrate had issued a warrant. This time, there would be no fine. On the morning of January 12, 1723, frost silvered the rooftops. Margaret rose before dawn, washed her face in icy water, and put on her best blue wool dress, the one Thomas had bought her for their 20th anniversary. She pinged her hair neatly, not out of submission, but dignity. If they want a show, she thought, let them see a woman, not a monster. The walk to the market square felt endless. Neighbors drew curtains. Shopkeepers turned away. Even Reverend Poole, who'd once praised her charity during the smallpox outbreak, gave her a tight-lipped nod from his garden gate. The stocks stood near the ancient market cross, its stone base worn smooth by centuries of feet and shame. They were crude but effective, two heavy oak planks, hinged at one end, with holes for ankles and wrists. Once locked, escape was impossible. Worse than pain was exposure, the helplessness, the stares, the slow erosion of personhood. Magistrate Thorne read the sentence with solemn gravity, as if delivering divine judgment. Margaret Scott, for thy repeated and scandalous disturbances of the peace, thy railing against lawful authority, and thy refusal to conduct thyself with the modesty befitting thy sex and station, thou art hereby sentenced to 2 hours in the stocks, there to reflect upon thy sins and seek amendment of life. No trial. No witnesses. Just the weight of reputation. The bailiffs, Jem, young and nervous, and old Tom, who'd known her since childhood, approached. Jem avoided her eyes. Old Tom sighed softly as he fastened the top beam. Sorry, Meg, he muttered. She gave a single nod. No tears. No curses. Then the crowd surged forward. At first, it was laughter. Boys mimicked her voice. Thou art a bloated toad. Women tittered behind gloved hands. A drunkard from the Lamb tossed a rotten turnip. It splattered at her feet. Someone shouted. Witch. A word that carried more fear than truth, but stuck like burrs. But then came the silences that cut deeper. Mrs. Price, her closest friend since girlhood, walked past with her daughter, Eliza. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. Then Mrs. Price looked away, gripping Eliza's hand tighter, as if Margaret's shame might rub off like soot. Young Tom Henshaw, Mrs. Henshaw's son, lingered near the butcher's stall. He met her gaze, opened his mouth as if to speak, then ducked his head and vanished into the crowd. Margaret stared straight ahead, focusing on the church spire, on the clouds scudding east. She recited the Lord's Prayer in her mind, not for forgiveness, but for anchor. Then, movement. A small boy, barefoot despite the cold, darted from behind the apothecary's cart. He couldn't have been more than 7, freckled, with straw-colored hair. In his grubby hand, a single wildflower, violet, stubborn, blooming too early in the winter soil. He dropped it at her feet, then fled before anyone could stop him. Margaret's breath caught. In that moment, she wasn't the scold. She was just Margaret. Seen. Human. The rest of the 2 hours passed in a haze of ache and revelation. Her legs cramped. Her back stiffened. Flies buzzed around the turnip pulp. But her mind raced, not with rage, but regret. Had her voice become a weapon? Had her truths drowned out others' fears? Was justice worth nothing if it left allies trembling in doorways? When the bailiff finally unlocked the stocks, She stood slowly, every joint protesting. She picked up the crushed violet, tucked it into her bodice, and walked home without a word. That night, alone in her cottage, Margaret lit a single candle and took out her journal, the one Thomas had given her, its leather cover cracked with age. She hadn't written in months. Now, the words poured out, raw and unguarded. January 12, 1723. They put me in the stocks today. Not for lying. Not for stealing. But for speaking too loud, too often, too true, or so I believed. But truth without mercy is just noise. And noise frightens people. I thought I was defending the weak, but perhaps I was only feeding my own pride. Mrs. Henshaw hasn't come to see me. Young Tom avoids my stall. Even Mrs. Price, God forgive me, looks through me as if I'm glass. I do not regret standing for Bessie the pig. But I regret the way I did it, with fire in my mouth and ice in my heart. There is a difference between courage and cruelty, even when both wear the same face. If I am to speak again, let it be with open hands, not clenched fists. Let it be for others, not for myself. She didn't write an apology to Thorne. That would be performance, and she was done with performance. Instead, she began to listen. Over the next weeks, she kept to her cottage, weaving cloth, baking oatcakes, and tending her herb garden. She attended church but sat in the back pew. When neighbors passed, she nodded politely but didn't engage. Slowly, cautiously, the town began to forget the spectacle and remember the woman. Then came Eliza Carter. One rainy afternoon in March, a knock sounded at Margaret's door. There stood Eliza, now 16, eyes red from crying, clutching a damp shawl. "Mistress Scott," she whispered, "my father's been accused of stealing thread from the mill. They say he'll be whipped or sent to the colonies." Margaret invited her in, stoked the fire, and poured tea. As Eliza spoke, Margaret listened not just to the facts, but to the fear beneath them. The mill owner, Mr. Fenwick, claimed 50 yards of fine linen thread had vanished. Eliza's father, a weaver named Henry, had worked late that week. No one else had access. But his honest. Eliza sobbed. He'd never. Margaret asked quiet questions. When was the thread last counted? Who keeps the ledger? Has anyone else been working late? The answers revealed a pattern. The overseer, Mr. Croft, had recently bought new boots and paid off a gambling debt. And the ledger showed the thread was logged as delivered 2 weeks before Henry's shift. The next day, Margaret went to Magistrate Thorne not with shouts, but with a request. "Your worship," she said, standing respectfully in his study, "might I examine the mill's inventory records? I recall a clause in the manor court rolls that requires double entry for goods over 10 shillings. Thorne frowned. "Why should I grant you such access?" "Because," she said evenly, "if an innocent man is punished, the law is dishonored, not just the man." To her surprise, he agreed. Within days, discrepancies emerged. Croft fled town. Henry Carter was cleared. Eliza returned with a basket of eggs and tears in her eyes. "You saved us," she said. Margaret shook her head. "You saved yourselves by telling the truth. I just helped others hear it." Word spread not of Margaret's outbursts, but of her wisdom. A tenant farmer, fearing eviction over a disputed boundary, came seeking advice. Margaret recalled a 1698 survey map stored in the parish chest and helped him prove his claim. A young wife, terrified her husband would sell their cow to pay tavern debts, asked what rights she had. Margaret explained coverture law, but also suggested speaking to the parish clerk about poor relief. She never claimed expertise. Only memory, observation, and a willingness to sit with someone in their fear. In 1725, the incident with Martha Dawes tested her resolve. Martha, 14, worked as a scullery maid for Lady Ashworth, the squire's wife. One day, a silver spoon vanished from the dining room. Martha was found with it in her apron pocket. She'd been polishing silver and panicked when it slipped in unnoticed. Lady Ashworth demanded punishment. "Thieving brat," she declared. "She'll go to Bridewell." Margaret visited Martha in the lockup, a dank cell behind the constable's house. The girl trembled, eyes wide with terror. "I didn't mean to," she cried. "It fell in, I forgot." Margaret believed her. But belief wasn't enough. She went to Ashworth Manor, not as an accuser, but as a petitioner. "My lady," she said, standing in the grand hall, sunlight glinting off porcelain, "you value honesty, do you not?" Lady Ashworth arched a brow. "Of course." "Then consider this. Punishing Martha will teach her fear, not honesty. But if you allow her to return the spoon and work off its worth in service, you'll gain a loyal maid and spare a child a mark that would follow her to her grave." For a long moment, Lady Ashworth studied her, the woman once mocked in the stocks, now speaking with calm authority. "Very well," she said at last. "But only because you asked." Martha served 6 months extra, then became Lady Ashworth's trusted chambermaid. Years later, she'd send Margaret jars of quince jam every Christmas. Margaret never remarried. She never had children. But in time, the town stopped calling her the scold. Children waved. Shopkeepers saved her the first strawberries of summer. And every spring, someone always anonymously left purple violets on her doorstep. She kept the first one, pressed inside her Bible. Between Proverbs 15 verse 1, "A soft answer turns away wrath," and Micah 6 verse 8, "Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly." In her final years, visitors sometimes asked how she endured the shame. She'd smile faintly. "Shame is a mirror," she'd say. "Most folks look into it and see only their worst self. But if you stare long enough, you see what needs mending." And that's where healing begins. When she died in 1747 at 72, the parish buried her beside Thomas beneath a simple stone, Margaret Scott, widow, friend, keeper of truths. No mention of the stocks. No record of her outbursts. Just her name, and the quiet legacy of a woman who learned that the loudest voices don't always carry the farthest, and that real strength lies not in defiance alone, but in the courage to change. Public shaming punishments like the stocks faded from English law by the mid-19th century, deemed barbaric and ineffective. Yet, the impulse to punish through humiliation endures in viral scandals, in courtroom theatrics, in the curated outrage of digital mobs. Margaret Scott's story reminds us that justice without empathy breeds resentment, not reform. That pride can masquerade as principle. And that true reconciliation isn't performed, it's practiced, quietly, daily, in acts of repair. For those who've spoken too loudly in pain only to realize their voice drowned out the very people they meant to protect, Margaret's journey offers hope. It's never too late to mend what pride has broken. Not with grand apologies, but with steady presence. Not with performance, but with patience. And sometimes, all it takes is one small act of grace, a wildflower dropped at the feet of the shamed, to remind us that we are still worthy of being seen.